Indigenous Rights Radio, because knowledge is power.
You are now listening to Cultural Survival's Global News Bulletin. Every month, Cultural Survival brings you the latest news impacting indigenous peoples across the globe. This March edition features important stories from Europe, North, Central, and South America, Africa, Asia, and beyond. Starting news from North America. In USA, South Dakota lawmakers have approved a policy recognizing the importance of tribal consultation while stopping short of making regular meetings illegal requirements. The House State Affairs Committee passed House Bill 1232, which encourages state agencies to collaborate with tribes on programs affecting their members. However, the committee removed language that would have mandated documentation of these efforts to avoid potential litigation. Meanwhile, a separate proposal to create a formal commission meeting 4 times a year failed. Opponents argued that relationships cannot be legislated, while supporters claimed a formal structure is necessary for long-term stability. News from Canada. Indigenous leaders in northern Quebec have filed a landmark lawsuit against the provincial government to cancel forestry permits on their ancestral territory. After years of blockades and failed negotiations, Atikamekw leaders and land defenders are challenging Quebec's authority to authorize industrial logging within Naidowisiwa Aski without genuine consultation. The plaintiffs argue that large-scale clear-cutting has decimated their ability to harvest traditional medicines and food. This unprecedented legal action seeks to establish Aboriginal title through the courts, potentially setting a major national precedent for how provincial governments must respect Indigenous land rights before granting resource permits. In Australia, traditional owners have launched a landmark $1.5 billion federal lawsuit against the Western Australian government to address the nation's worst mesothelioma disaster. The Bunzima Native Title Aboriginal Corporation is demanding the urgent removal of 3 million tons of toxic blue asbestos waste from the former mining town of Wittenoom. Advocates highlight the indigenous Western Australians face the world's highest mesothelioma mortality rates, as the site remains the Southern Hemisphere's largest contaminated zone. The claim seeks the remediations of polluted waterways and the sealing of abandoned mines, arguing that decades of government inactions have barred traditional owners from their ancestral lands. Now, news from Africa, starting from Kenya. A news report by Kenya National Commission on Human Rights reveals that indigenous communities are facing widespread land dispossession and environmental damage due to large-scale investment projects. The study, titled Voices from the Land, details how developments in energy, oil, and conservation across 13 counties often result in human rights violations and cultural disruption. Commission Chairperson Clarice Oganga warns that groups such as the Maasai and Turkana are being sidelined from economic decision-making and denied fair compensation. The Commission is now calling on government to enforce stricter land protections and ensure local communities are consulted before any future projects begin. In Tanzanian indigenous communities have filed formal grievances against the World Bank, charging the institutions with failing to repair the devastation caused by its $100 million regrow projects. Although the bank terminated the tourism initiative in 2024 following reports of extrajudicial killings and forced evictions, elders and villagers say the nightmare continues. Advocates report that wildlife rangers are still terrorizing ancestral lands, while new eviction orders threaten tens of thousands of people despite bank promises of protection. They are calling for immediate redress, demanding that the World Bank finally use its leverage to halt these ongoing human rights abuses. Now moving to Asia, starting from Japan. A groundbreaking study has confirmed that indigenous smoke drying burial traditions across Asia and Southeast Asia are among the oldest in the world, dating back over 10,000 years. By analyzing remains from China to Indonesia, researchers found that these sacred preservation methods, long practiced by Papuan indigenous communities, predates the mummification of ancient Egypt and Chile's Chinchorro culture. Experts also emphasize that this discovery honors the rich spirituality of indigenous hunter-gatherers whose sophisticated techniques for mourning and honoring the deceased have persisted across the region for millennia. This finding finally recognizes these ancient ancestral practices as a global cornerstone of human cultural history. In the Philippines, in a historic win for ancestral land rights, the Philippine Supreme Court has ruled that mining companies must secure the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples before renewing operations. The court vacated an earlier arbitration award favoring Lepanto Consolidated Mining, declaring that private contracts cannot bypass the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act 1997. This decision establishes that protecting indigenous ancestral domains is a non-negotiable public policy. For indigenous communities, this confirms that their land is not merely a resource for exploitation, but a constitutional right that no private agreement or a legal loophole can ignore. In Taiwan, indigenous nations across Taiwan are leading a powerful cultural regeneration, transforming ancient music and dance from static heritage into living resistance. Moving beyond colonial assimilations and government-led preservations, communities like Siddiqui and Bunun are utilizing polyphonic traditions to heal from historical trauma and reconnect with ancestral lands. From the manuscripts of a self-sufficient ecotourism to university decolonization projects and the rise of chart-topping youth artists singing in native languages, these movements assert that our traditions are dynamic and self-governed. This resurgence marks a decisive shift from being subjects of a study to becoming the masters of our own vibrant, evolving cultural future. In Nepal, Nepal has made history as the first Asian nation to sign $55 million carbon credit agreement with the LEAF coalition to curb deforestation. LEAF is an innovative global public-private initiative comprising over 30 major companies and governments of Norway, United Kingdom, United States, and Republic of Korea, covering 3 provinces. The deal aims to reward forest-dependent communities for their conservation efforts through 2026. However, experts warn that success depends on overcoming bureaucratic hurdles. While the local groups are pushing for 80% of the funds to be delivered directly to the grassroots, concerns remain regarding administrative fees and transparent benefit sharing. To meet its net zero goals, the government must now ensure these complex financial rewards actually reach the indigenous protectors of the land. Now moving to Latin and South Americas. Starting from Brazil, the Brazilian government has suspended grazing operations on the Tapajós River following 2 weeks of intense protests by indigenous communities. Hundreds of demonstrators had camped outside a major Cargill port terminal to demand action from President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's administration. Local tribes argued that the port expansion and river exploitation for grain exports threaten their vital waterways and traditional way of life. In response to the unrest, officials promised that no further work will proceed without free, prior, and informed consultation with the affected communities, marking a significant victory for indigenous land and water rights. In Chile, Mapuche communities across Chile held their 14th annual mobilization to demand official state recognition for their ancestral language, Mapujucún. When siding with International Mother Language Day, protesters denounced successive governments for failing to guarantee basic linguistic rights or fulfill international indigenous treaties. Despite a decade of sustained community-led revitalization efforts, organizers say the Chilean state has neglected its historical debt to the Wallmapu territory. The movement continues to praise for a formal legal framework to protect their heritage, insisting that the survival of their culture depends on the urgent officialization of their native tongue. In Argentina, indigenous communities and environmental activists in Jujuy are intensifying protests against proposed reforms to Argentina's glacier law. Demonstrators warn that the national government's bill would grant mining companies unprecedented access to protected periglacial zones, risking the contamination of vital freshwater reserves. Critics argue the move prioritizes industrial profits over environmental safety and local survival. Protesters are now demanding clear expansions from provincial and national representatives, insisting that any rollback of these protections directly threatens the region's long-term water security. In Ecuador, indigenous Quechua communities in Ecuador have launched a landmark initiative to serve as frontline defenders of the Yasuni Biospheres Reserve, known as the People of the Jungle. The Quechua del Currarre are deploying ancestral knowledge and new technology to protect 190,000 hectares of territory from encroaching mining and oil interests. This strategic buffer zone borders the Tagueiri-Taramenane Intangible Zone, home to tribes living in voluntary isolation. Over the next decade, the project aims to integrate indigenous leadership into national park management, ensuring the survival of the planet's most biodiverse landscape against industrial exploitation. In Nicaragua, dozens of indigenous Mixteco families are seeking refuge in Costa Rica as humanitarian crisis deepens along the Nicaragua-Honduras border. Displacement has surged since 2023, driven by a violent campaign of land invasions by armed settlers. Refugees report harrowing accounts of harassment and targeted killings, claiming these paramilitary groups seize ancestral territories with the silent backing of local authorities. With traditional livelihoods destroyed and violence escalating, social organizations warn that the lack of protection is forcing entire communities into exile. Human rights advocates are now calling for urgent international attention to address the growing regional instability. In Bolivia, indigenous communities across the Bolivian Amazon are demanding that the government halt proposed legislative reforms that threaten their ancestral lands. Presenting a formal platform of demands, leaders warned that changes to the agrarian regime could lead to the commodification of land and erosion of collective property rights. The groups are calling for urgent dialogue by late March to ensure legal security and respect for their territorial sovereignty. Beyond land protections, the agenda seeks the establishment of an indigenous university and the integration of traditional medicine into the national health system to preserve their cultural heritage. That is all for this edition of Cultural Survival's Global News Bulletin. Stay tuned for our next broadcast. For more information on the rights of indigenous peoples, visit cs.org and follow Cultural Survival on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Threads, and Blue Sky. If you found this program valuable, subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave us a 5-star review on Spotify. You can also follow us on TikTok at Radio Derecho Indigenous.